The routine that changed everything. The morning light drifted gently through the half-open curtains of a small apartment tucked away on the quieter side of the city, where life always felt one step slower than the chaos downtown, and dreams often struggled to catch up with rent. Hope and time. Amelia Torres sat by the window, her sketchpad resting on her knees, a half-finished design glowing softly in the reflection of her tablet. She had been awake since dawn, sipping black coffee gone cold, her hair tied in a messy knot, eyes faintly ringed by exhaustion that could not be hidden behind any amount of optimism. For the past month, something had been wrong. Not something dramatic, just a creeping kind of tiredness that refused to go away. At first, she blamed her work. Endless client revisions, tight deadlines, and the stress of juggling freelancing with part-time shifts at a small design studio. But deep down, she knew it wasn't just fatigue. Her body felt foreign to her, unsteady. Her reflection had lost its usual glow, and though she tried to ignore it, fear began whispering quietly at the edges of her mind. Her phone buzzed against the table, a reminder she had set 2 weeks ago. Doctor's appointment, 10:30 a.m. Amelia stared at it for a long moment before finally rising, brushing a few pencil shavings off her lap. She had delayed this checkup 3 times, convincing herself it wasn't urgent, but the truth was, she was afraid. Not of doctors exactly, but of bad news. Still, she got dressed carefully, choosing her favorite white blouse, simple jeans, and the small silver locket her mother had given her years ago. A little courage never hurt, she thought, as she tied her hair again, grabbed her worn leather bag, and stepped out into the bright city morning. The bus ride to Riverside Memorial Clinic was uneventful. Children pressed their faces against the glass. An old man snored softly near the back, and Amelia listened to the hum of the city through her earbuds. The clinic itself stood like a monument to contrast, half of it old brick, and the other half a sleek modern tower of glass. She remembered reading somewhere that it served everyone, from struggling students to billionaires who demanded privacy on the top floors. She smiled at the thought, wondering what kind of people went there for luxury checkups while others sat on plastic chairs downstairs waiting their turn for hours. She entered through the public entrance, filled out the forms the receptionist slid toward her without much interest, and took a seat in the crowded waiting area. She told herself again that it was just a routine checkup, nothing more. Meanwhile, across town, in a world of glass towers and private elevators, Ethan Blackwell adjusted the cuffs of his tailored shirt. His assistant briefed him on the morning schedule as they moved briskly through the lobby of Blackwell Technologies. At 38, Ethan was the kind of man who never missed a step. A perfectionist born into nothing and forged into something extraordinary. His name was etched on half the city's skyline, but if success was his armor, it was also his prison. Every move calculated, every emotion locked behind years of discipline and control. Yet lately, a strange thought had been haunting him. What came after all this? After the deals, the conferences, the applause? Was there anything left beyond the next achievement? Perhaps it was age, perhaps loneliness. But his personal doctor had convinced him to schedule a routine fertility and genetic preservation check, something Ethan considered a simple precaution, a business investment for his future. Though he had no immediate intention of starting a family, he agreed out of logic, not emotion. That same morning, he arrived at the private wing of the same Riverside Memorial Clinic, escorted directly through a secured elevator to the top floor, where quiet hallways smelled faintly of citrus and money. Nurses in polished white uniforms greeted him with respectful smiles. He signed forms, nodded to Dr. Hammond, and went through the process without thought, his mind already on his next meeting. He had no reason to believe that this small moment of medical efficiency would link his life forever to a woman he had never met. Downstairs, Amelia's name was finally called. A nurse named Rita, kind but hurried, led her into a room lined with pale blue walls. She spoke softly, asking routine questions as Amelia answered between polite smiles. "It's probably nothing," she murmured. "But I've been feeling so tired lately," Rita gave her an encouraging smile. "We'll run a few tests, just to be safe." "Dear." Then she stepped out, leaving Amelia alone with her thoughts. Moments later, another woman entered, younger, nervous, with smudged eyeliner and the name badge Zoe Chen, lab technician. She looked exhausted. The kind of exhaustion that comes from covering too many shifts and too few hours of rest. She apologized for the delay, fumbling with the tablet and the vials. Amelia didn't think much of it. People made mistakes all the time. But she didn't know that one simple mix-up would soon alter the entire trajectory of her life. As Zoe cross-checked room numbers and patient forms, the computer system glitched. Flickering between entries, she tapped impatiently, unaware that in the system's confusion, room 12A, Ethan Blackwell's fertility preservation appointment, had been replaced by room 21B, Amelia Torres's checkup. Tired and disoriented, Zoe followed what the screen told her. And within moments, the unthinkable happened. A procedure meant for a private patient upstairs had been mistakenly administered to an unsuspecting woman downstairs. Amelia felt uneasy, confused by what was happening. But Zoe's calm, professional tone convinced her it was all standard. When it was over, she was told she could go home. The rest of the day unfolded like any other. Amelia bought groceries, answered client emails, and finished a logo design for a bakery. The world still looked the same, though fate had already shifted beneath her feet. Weeks passed before the first signs appeared: the nausea, the sensitivity to smell, the sudden tears at commercials. At first, she dismissed them. Then one morning, she found herself sitting on the bathroom floor, holding a small white stick that bore a symbol that would change everything. The tiny plus sign stared back at her, unyielding. Panic gripped her chest. She couldn't breathe. She hadn't been with anyone in months. She was careful, disciplined, responsible, impossible, she whispered, shaking her head. She rushed back to the clinic, demanding answers. The receptionist called for Dr. Hammond, and within minutes, Amelia found herself in a private office with two people, the doctor and a man in a dark suit. A lawyer, their faces were pale, their eyes heavy with the weight of guilt. When Dr. Hammond spoke, his voice trembled. "Ms. Torres, there's been a terrible mistake," he said. "A procedural error, something that should never have happened." Amelia's heartbeat thundered in her ears. "What kind of error?" she asked, barely whispering. "You were given the wrong procedure," he continued carefully. "One that was intended for another patient." She shook her head in disbelief. "What do you mean, wrong procedure?" The lawyer leaned forward, his tone sterile. "Ms. Torres, you're pregnant." The words fell like stones. Echoing through the sterile white room, Amelia froze. Her world stopped. "That's impossible," she whispered. "I came for a checkup." Dr. Hammond looked away. "We have identified the source of the material used in error." He hesitated. "It belongs to Mr. Ethan Blackwell." For a long moment, there was only silence. The kind that suffocates. Amelia stared at them, trying to piece together something that defied logic. A billionaire she'd never met, a hospital mistake, and a life growing inside her because of it. When she finally found her voice, it cracked. "You're telling me I'm carrying a stranger's child because you mixed up forms?" The lawyer began to explain policies, compensation, confidentiality, but Amelia didn't hear any of it. She stood up and walked out. Her vision blurred by tears she didn't remember starting to fall. The city outside was the same as it had been that morning. Bright, alive, unaware that a single woman's world had shattered in silence. That evening, she sat by her window again, the same place where the day had started. Her reflection in the glass looked unfamiliar, tired but fierce. She didn't know what to do, who to call, or how to process the weight of it all. Her phone buzzed suddenly, the screen flashing an unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. "Ms. Torres?" The voice was deep, composed, calm. "This is Ethan Blackwell," he said. Her breath caught. "I just learned about the incident at the clinic. We need to meet, please." For a long time, Amelia said nothing, her mind spinning between disbelief and fury. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. "Tomorrow," she said quietly. "You tell me where." She hung up before he could respond, closing her eyes as the first tear slid down her cheek. Outside, the city lights shimmered like 1,000 tiny stars reflected in broken glass, and somewhere in that vast world, two people who had never meant to meet were now bound by something neither had chosen. Yet both would soon discover that sometimes life's cruelest mistakes carried the seeds of its most unexpected miracles. The unexpected meeting. The next day began with a heavy stillness in the air. the kind that settles before a storm. When even the hum of the city feels quieter than usual, Amelia stood before her mirror, staring at her own reflection as though searching for a version of herself that still made sense. The woman looking back at her seemed unfamiliar. Her hair perfectly brushed, her blue dress carefully chosen, her eyes shadowed by sleeplessness, yet burning with quiet determination. She had spent the night replaying every word from the doctor's office, every impossible sentence that had shattered the rhythm of her life. It still felt unreal, a story that could not belong to her. And yet the soft ache in her body, the gentle nausea at dawn, reminded her that this was no nightmare she could wake from. This was her new reality. She had agreed to meet him, the man whose name had suddenly become tied to her future. But every instinct screamed at her that she was stepping into a world that did not belong to her. A world of power, privilege, and control that she had never imagined would collide with her quiet existence. When the black sedan arrived precisely at 1:30, the driver's posture was professional, respectful, offering no curiosity. Amelia hesitated only a moment before stepping inside. The leather smelled faintly of cedar, and the hum of the engine felt too quiet, almost ceremonial, as though this drive was not just a commute but a crossing into something irreversible. Through the tinted windows, the city stretched out like two separate worlds. The one she knew, full of noise and worn-out streets, and the one she was heading toward, the world of mirrored glass, luxury towers, and names printed in bold on magazine covers. When the car turned into the private entrance of Blackwell Tower, her pulse began to quicken. The building itself rose like a monument of ambition, its walls gleaming against the afternoon sun, reflecting the skyline back upon itself as though even the city bowed to its owner. The elevator ride to the top floor was silent except for the faint whir of machinery. When the doors opened, she was met by a woman in a gray suit who smiled with a kind of polished warmth that only comes from long practice. "Ms. Torres, Mr. Blackwell is expecting you," she said softly. Guiding her through a corridor lined with modern art and glass walls overlooking the endless city below, Amelia had seen wealth before, but never like this. Not just luxury, but precision. Every corner of the space felt calculated, disciplined, designed to communicate control. When she stepped into the main office, she stopped for a breath. The view alone was staggering. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city as though it were a painting. The furniture sleek, minimalist, all silver and dark wood, and there, standing near the glass, was Ethan Blackwell. He turned as she entered, and for a moment, the world seemed to pause. He looked exactly as she had seen in photographs. Tall, broad-shouldered, his dark hair touched with the faintest trace of gray, his presence quiet but commanding. Yet there was something unexpected in his eyes, not arrogance as she had feared, but a kind of weariness, the kind that only comes from years of carrying the invisible weight of success. "Ms. Torres," he said, his voice deep, steady, but not cold. "Thank you for coming." She didn't respond immediately, her throat too dry, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. "Did I really have a choice?" she said finally, her tone sharper than she intended, but honest. His expression shifted slightly, not offended, not defensive, but almost understanding. "You always have a choice," he said quietly, gesturing toward the chair across from his desk. She sat without looking away from him, determined not to appear intimidated. Yet she could feel the strange gravity of his presence pulling her into silence. For a while, neither spoke. The ticking of an invisible clock filled the air between them. Ethan was the first to break it. "I'm not going to pretend I understand what you're going through," he said carefully, his words deliberate, measured. "When I learned what happened, I thought it was a joke or a misunderstanding. It took hours before I realized this wasn't something that could be undone." His hands rested on the desk, fingers intertwined, the gesture of a man used to controlling chaos. "The clinic failed both of us in ways that words can't justify. I have already initiated legal action." "But I didn't ask you here to talk about lawsuits." Amelia leaned back slightly, her eyes narrowing. "Then what did you ask me here for?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. "To tell me how you plan to fix this with money?" Ethan's jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. "No," he said. "Money can't fix this. Not for either of us. I asked you here because this isn't just a legal issue, it's human, and whatever you decide to do, I need you to know that I take full responsibility for the life that now exists between us." His words hit her harder than she expected. She had imagined anger, arrogance, perhaps pity, but not this. Sincerity. He looked at her not as a problem to solve, but as a person standing at the same impossible crossroads. Still, the distance between them was too vast to cross with a single apology. "I didn't ask for any of this," Amelia said, her voice trembling despite her effort to hold it steady. "I came in for a checkup, and now my life is a headline I never agreed to. You have no idea what it feels like to lose control of your own body, your own future." Ethan's gaze softened, his usual composure cracking for just a second. "You're right," he said. "I don't know what that feels like. But I know what it feels like to build something only to have it taken away without warning. I know what it's like to lose control, and I won't let that happen to you again. Not because of me." They sat in silence for a long moment after that. The kind of silence that says more than words can. Outside the window, the city shimmered under the afternoon light. Cars moved like silver veins through the streets below, and somewhere far away, sirens wailed, reminding them both that life continued, even when theirs had been paused by fate. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his tone quieter now. "You don't owe me anything, Amelia, but I need you to understand this child. Whatever happens next, I will be there, not because it's expected, but because it's right." His voice caught on that last word. And for the first time, Amelia saw the man behind the legend, a man who was used to commanding boardrooms but not matters of the heart. She looked away, trying to steady her emotions. The truth was, she didn't know what she wanted yet. Part of her still wanted to run, to wake up and find that all of this had been some cruel mix-up that could be erased with a phone call. But another part of her, the quieter, braver part, knew there was no escaping it. She was already connected to this man through something larger than either of them could control. "What do you expect me to do?" she asked finally. "Keep it, end it, raise it with you watching over every move I make?" The bitterness in her voice surprised even her. Ethan's eyes met hers steadily. "I expect you to make the decision that feels right for you. Not for me, not for anyone else," he said. "And whatever that decision is, I'll stand by it." Something shifted in the air between them then. Not comfort, not understanding, but the first fragile thread of respect. For a long time, neither of them spoke, until finally Amelia rose from her chair. "I don't know what I'm going to do," she said quietly. "But I know I can't decide it in a glass tower." She turned toward the door, her heartbeat echoing in her ears. Ethan stood as well, but didn't stop her. "Amelia," he called softly as she reached the elevator. She turned, her eyes meeting his once more. "Whatever you decide, I just want you to know. I never imagined I'd be the kind of man who wanted something more than control." His voice softened. "But maybe this is the universe's way of reminding me that some things aren't meant to be controlled." She said nothing, only gave a small nod before the elevator doors closed between them, sealing the moment in silence as the lift descended. Amelia pressed a hand against her stomach. Not in acceptance yet, but in acknowledgement. Inside her was something that didn't belong to either of their worlds, yet belonged to both of their lives. A strange, fragile bridge between two strangers who had never meant to meet when she stepped back onto the street. The wind lifted her hair and the sun glinted off the glass above her, and for the first time since the nightmare began, she took a deep breath that didn't taste entirely like fear. It tasted like the beginning of something she didn't yet have a name for. That night, back in her apartment, Amelia sat on her couch surrounded by sketches. Her laptop blinking softly on the table, she stared at the blank screen for a long time before finally typing a message. Her fingers trembled slightly as she wrote, "I don't know what the future looks like, but I think we need to talk again." She hovered over the send button for a moment, then pressed it somewhere high above the city. Ethan Blackwell's phone buzzed where it lay beside a pile of documents. When he saw her name, he exhaled deeply, setting the papers aside. For the first time in years, business could wait. Between worlds, the rain began before dawn, slow and steady, the kind that makes the whole city feel softer, quieter, as if time itself has decided to rest. Amelia stood by the window with a cup of tea cooling in her hands. her eyes tracing the streaks of water sliding down the glass. It had been 3 weeks since she last saw Ethan. 3 long weeks of confusion, nausea, and silence. She had spent those days trying to build normalcy around something that could no longer be called ordinary. Work calls, sketches, client deadlines, all felt distant, like echoes of a life that no longer belonged to her. Every morning when she looked at her reflection, she saw a new uncertainty taking root. Her body was changing subtly, quietly, but her mind was still tangled in fear. She had not yet decided what to do about the pregnancy, though the decision felt less like a choice and more like a tide pulling her towards something she could neither resist nor understand. Ethan had respected her wish for space, but that didn't mean he had stopped thinking about her. He had thrown himself into work as he always did. But there were moments, usually in the late hours when the office lights had dimmed and the city outside had turned to shadows, that he found himself staring at the file with her name on it. Amelia Torres, a woman who by all logic should have been a stranger, and yet had become the one person he couldn't stop thinking about. He had read the clinic's reports 100 times, memorized every line of the legal statements, but none of that told him who she truly was, what she dreamed of, what frightened her, or how she was coping with the storm that fate had forced upon her. He told himself he wanted to make sure she was okay, that he had a moral obligation, but deep down, a quiet truth whispered something different. He wanted to see her again, not as a problem to fix, but as a person whose presence had unsettled everything he thought he knew about control. That morning, when his assistant informed him that Ms. Torres had requested a meeting, his heart reacted faster than his mind. "Send her up when she arrives," he said, trying to sound composed, but his voice carried a softness that did not escape the assistant's notice. The rain had slowed by the time Amelia's car arrived at the tower. She stepped out holding an umbrella that the wind immediately tried to steal from her hair damp at the edges, her coat clinging to her frame, yet her eyes were steady. There was something different about her today, a quiet strength that hadn't been there before, as if surviving the last few weeks had carved something resilient inside her. When she entered the office, Ethan stood from his chair almost instinctively. She noticed the faint surprise on his face, as though seeing her again made everything too real. "I wasn't sure you'd actually come," he said, breaking the silence that hung between them. "I wasn't sure either," she replied honestly, her voice calm but carrying the fatigue of sleepless nights. "But I'm tired of trying to pretend that this isn't happening." She sat down across from him, placing her bag gently on the table. "I needed to see you again, not as a name in a headline or a symbol of what went wrong, but as the man who's connected to this." She placed a hand over her stomach, a gesture so small yet so powerful that it seemed to take the air out of the room. Ethan lowered his gaze for a moment, collecting his thoughts. "You're right," he said quietly. "We can't undo what happened. But maybe we can decide what happens next. Together." Amelia's lips curved into a faint, weary smile. "Together," she repeated, as if testing the word. "That's not something I'm used to hearing from people like you." He looked up. "Confused? People like me?" She nodded. "The powerful, the untouchable, the ones who can rewrite mistakes with money and lawyers. But this isn't something you can buy your way through." He didn't deny it. Because she was right. He had built his life on solving problems with precision and resources. But this was beyond contracts and numbers. This was fragile, human, unpredictable. "You're not wrong," he said. "But maybe that's why this matters more than anything else ever has." She studied him carefully, searching for pretense, finding none. For the first time, she saw not the billionaire, but the man, tired, flawed, perhaps even lonely. "I went to my doctor yesterday," she said, her voice softening. "Everything looks healthy so far. The baby's fine." She paused, her eyes flickering briefly with emotion. "I didn't know how I'd feel hearing that, but when she said it, I cried, not out of fear this time, but something else, something like acceptance. Maybe." Ethan's expression shifted, a slow exhale escaping him. "Thank you for telling me," he said quietly. "You don't know what that means to me." They spent hours talking that afternoon, not about the clinic, not about lawsuits or compensation, but about life, about her work as a designer, about his obsession with perfection, about how both of them had learned to survive by keeping walls around their hearts, and how strange it was that fate had found a way to break those walls through chaos. At one point, Ethan poured them both tea from the small service on the counter, and when their fingers brushed as he handed her the cup, the world seemed to slow. Neither spoke of it, but something passed between them. Not romance yet, not attraction in the ordinary sense, but recognition, a fragile thread of shared humanity that neither could deny. As the sky darkened, Amelia stood to leave. "I don't know what comes next," she said honestly. "I'm still scared, and I don't trust how the world will treat this story if it ever gets out, but I think I want to face it instead of running from it." Ethan nodded. "You don't have to face it alone," he said. "I'll protect your privacy, your peace, whatever it takes." She looked at him for a long moment, then gave a quiet laugh. "You talk like protection is something you can guarantee, but life doesn't work that way." "Ethan." His name on her lips caught him off guard. He realized it was the first time she had ever said it. "Maybe not," he admitted, "but I'd like to try anyway." As she left the office that night, Ethan watched her go with a feeling he couldn't quite name, somewhere between admiration and longing. The elevator doors closed, and he found himself standing alone in a silence that no longer felt comforting. For years, he had lived surrounded by noise, meetings, deals, applause. But this new quietness felt different, alive, filled with the memory of her voice. He didn't know yet if this connection was destiny or disaster, but he knew one thing for certain. His life had already begun to change, and for the first time in years, that thought didn't terrify him. It gave him hope back in her apartment. Amelia placed a hand over her stomach again as she stood before the mirror. The rain had stopped, and the city lights reflected against the wet streets below. She whispered softly, "We're going to be okay," though she wasn't sure if she was saying it to herself. The child, or the man whose life had become entangled with hers. She looked out into the glittering night, unaware that in another tower across the city, Ethan was doing the same, staring at the same rain-washed skyline. Two people in different worlds bound by an invisible thread, both wondering where fate would lead them next, both afraid, both strangely hopeful. The storm of headlines. The first signs of winter crept into the city unnoticed. A thin silver fog drifting through the streets, wrapping every corner in quiet uncertainty. And for a while, Amelia believed that life had finally started to balance itself again. Weeks had passed since her last meeting with Ethan, and though their connection had deepened into something wordless yet powerful, she tried to keep her world small. Work, rest, the soft rhythm of a heartbeat inside her that grew stronger each day. She avoided social gatherings, ignored curious glances, and refused to let fear decide her future. But peace built on secrecy is fragile, and sometimes the smallest spark can set everything on fire. It happened on an ordinary Monday morning when she was halfway through breakfast, scrolling through her emails, still in her robe. At first, she didn't understand why her phone wouldn't stop vibrating, or why her inbox had suddenly filled with messages from unknown addresses, subject lines screaming her name. When she opened one of them, the air seemed to leave her lungs entirely. A photo, a name, a headline printed across every major outlet before she could even comprehend what she was seeing. Billionaire Ethan Blackwell caught in shocking clinic scandal, unknown woman pregnant after medical error. Her coffee cup slipped from her fingers and shattered on the floor, but she didn't even notice. Her body froze as her mind tried to process the words again and again, refusing to believe what her eyes told her. It couldn't be real, and yet every second another notification proved it was. The details were vague but precise enough to expose her. The city was already whispering, people connecting dots that should have remained unconnected. The gossip sites called her the mystery woman. The tabloids called her the accidental mother, and within hours she was no longer a private person, but a public story. Reporters camped near her building. Neighbors who once greeted her with warmth now peeked through blinds, measuring pity and curiosity in equal measure. Her phone kept ringing. Friends, journalists, strangers offering interviews, others sending threats. By noon, she felt like her entire life had been taken apart, each piece thrown to the world for judgment. Ethan heard the news while sitting in a board meeting high above the skyline. His assistant's trembling voice had broken through the steady rhythm of financial reports, whispering that a journalist had leaked confidential records. In seconds, the conversation around him vanished. The only sound left was the blood rushing in his ears. He rose without a word, ignoring the startled faces of his executives, and walked straight out of the meeting. By the time his car reached Amelia's street, chaos had already arrived. Cameras flashed like lightning. Microphones thrust toward the entrance of her apartment, reporters shouting questions that blurred into one merciless noise. He stepped out of the car, and the noise fell into stunned silence. The crowd parted as if the weight of his presence alone commanded space. Without hesitation, he entered the building, his security holding back the press. When Amelia opened the door, she was trembling, her face pale, her eyes swollen from tears she hadn't meant to cry. "They know everything," she whispered, her voice cracking. "They know about the clinic, about you, about me." He stepped closer, his tone steady even though inside he burned with fury. "They know parts of a story twisted by people who crave noise. Not truth," he said, his eyes locking on hers. "But I'll make sure they hear the truth from us. Not from rumors." She shook her head, frustration spilling from her every movement. "You can't fix this with press statements. Ethan, they've already decided who I am. I'm the girl who trapped a billionaire. I'm the scandal that sells papers." She turned away, pacing the small living room like a bird fighting against invisible walls. "I didn't ask for any of this," she said again, her voice small now. "I just wanted to live quietly." He watched her for a moment, the guilt carving itself deeper into his chest. "Then let me protect you," he said softly. "Let me take this on myself. You shouldn't have to hide from a world that doesn't even know your truth." That night, for the first time in years, Ethan Blackwell faced cameras not as a CEO, but as a man with something to lose. The conference hall was overflowing, the air electric with anticipation, reporters shouting over one another. He stood behind the podium, every word measured but not rehearsed, his voice calm and grounded. "I am here to address the truth," he began. "Months ago, a devastating mistake occurred at a medical facility I trusted. A woman, innocent of any wrongdoing, became the victim of that error. Her privacy was violated, her peace destroyed, and yet she has shown more dignity and strength than anyone could imagine." The room fell silent, except for the furious clicking of cameras. "Her name will not be shared by me," he continued, "because she deserves the protection that this world has denied her. I take full responsibility for the child we now share. This child was not born out of choice, but it will never be treated as a mistake. I ask that the woman involved be left in peace." It was the first time the public had seen the controlled billionaire speak with something other than cold precision. His honesty stunned them, and the tone of the story began to shift. Overnight, the internet turned from accusation to admiration, from gossip to reluctant respect. Even those who had mocked Amelia's silence now found themselves moved by a man willing to expose vulnerability to defend her. But Amelia didn't watch the broadcast in real time. She sat curled on her couch, the volume muted, watching his lips move, the tremor in his hands, the faint strain in his eyes when he spoke about dignity and responsibility. She didn't need to hear the words to understand what they meant. He had stood before the world not to save himself, but to save her. For the first time since that nightmare began, she felt her heart unclench. In the days that followed, the storm began to quiet. The same papers that had hunted her now published apologies. Ethan's lawyers moved quickly, forcing retractions, securing privacy orders. Still, the experience left scars that could not be erased by silence. There were nights when she woke from dreams of flashing cameras, of strangers shouting her name, her heart pounding as if she were still trapped in that chaos. And every time, the phone would light up with a simple message. "Are you all right?" He never asked for more, never demanded gratitude, but his presence was constant, steady as breath. Weeks later, when the noise of the city had softened and the world had moved on to other scandals, Ethan visited again. He brought with him a small paper bag of her favorite pastries from the bakery down the street. They sat by the window where the rain streaked the glass, sharing quiet conversation that felt almost normal. She told him about her design work, about a new project that gave her hope. He told her about the changes he was making to his company. Fewer late nights, more time to breathe. Somewhere in that stillness, they began to smile again. It was near the end of that visit when Amelia felt the faintest flutter beneath her ribs, small, almost imperceptible, but enough to steal her breath. She froze, her hand instinctively pressing to her stomach. "What is it?" Ethan asked quickly, worry in his eyes. She looked at him with tears forming but a smile trembling on her lips. "It moved," she whispered. For a second he didn't understand. Then realization dawned and his breath caught. Without thinking, she took his hand and guided it to the place where the movement had come. He stood utterly still, waiting, and then there it was, a tiny push from life itself. For a moment, the world around them ceased to exist. No headlines, no noise, no past, only the miracle between them. They stayed like that for a long time, their hands joined over the small flutter that symbolized everything both of them had lost and found. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, reverent. "That's the most incredible thing I've ever felt." Amelia nodded, unable to speak, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. She wasn't crying out of fear anymore. She was crying because for the first time she believed that something good might still come out of chaos, that something born from a mistake could still become the greatest part of her story. Later, when he left, she watched him disappear into the misty night and felt an unfamiliar warmth linger inside her chest. It wasn't love yet, not in the romantic sense, but it was something deeper. Trust, respect, the fragile beginning of hope. She walked back to the window, whispering to the life within her, "You're going to be okay, little one. We both are." Outside, the rain had stopped, the sky clearing just enough for the first pale star to shine through the clouds. And somewhere far above the sleeping city, it seemed as if the universe itself had finally exhaled, giving them both permission to begin again. The promise of tomorrow. Winter yielded slowly to spring, as if the earth itself had grown cautious after so much turmoil. Mornings arrived softer now, light spilling through the curtains of Amelia's apartment, in a warmth that felt almost like forgiveness. The city outside no longer watched her with cruel curiosity. It simply moved on, as cities always do, swallowing yesterday's headlines in the rhythm of new days. And in that quiet, she found room to breathe again. Her belly had grown round and firm beneath the fabric of her dresses, each movement of the baby a silent reminder that life continued regardless of fear, regardless of the past. She had learned to live with the rhythm of waiting, painting, designing, walking slowly in the park near the river where she once used to sketch for clients. Now she carried a small notebook only for herself, drawing shapes that no one paid for, waves, branches, silhouettes, all reflections of a heart learning how to hope again. Ethan visited often now, not with the nervous distance of obligation, but with a kind of quiet familiarity that came naturally. He never arrived unannounced. Yet she had learned to sense him before he knocked. The calm authority in his voice softened by something gentler each time. Sometimes he brought groceries, sometimes books, sometimes simply his company. He would sit at her table while she worked, reading financial reports but never seeming truly absorbed by them. Every few minutes his gaze would drift toward her, toward the small movements that marked their child's existence. It had become a pattern between them. Shared silence, small laughter, unspoken comfort. Somewhere in that unspoken rhythm, something changed. The tension that once hovered between them began to dissolve, replaced by an understanding that needed no declaration. One evening, as the last of winter's cold faded from the air, Ethan insisted she move temporarily into his countryside estate for the final weeks before delivery. It wasn't luxury he offered, but safety, privacy away from the flash of cameras and the weight of whispers. At first she refused, pride holding tight to her independence. But when he spoke, his voice carried the calm sincerity that had slowly earned her trust. "It's only until the baby comes, Amelia. Nothing more." And somehow those words felt less like control and more like care. So she agreed. The drive out of the city felt like a quiet exile, the skyline fading into open fields and sunlit hills. When they arrived, she was surprised by how peaceful the place felt. Not ostentatious, but warm. A wide veranda overlooking a garden of wild lavender, old oak trees standing like sentinels around a house that felt lived in rather than displayed. Days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of life there became its own kind of healing. Mornings began with bird song instead of traffic. Evenings ended with the smell of rain drifting in through open windows. Ethan worked remotely, often setting up his laptop near her chair so she wouldn't feel alone. Sometimes he read aloud the news just to make her laugh at how the world moved endlessly on. Sometimes they sat without speaking, watching the horizon change color as the sun dipped below the fields. Slowly, quietly, a companionship deepened into something more intimate. Not in the rush of romance, but in the steady trust of two people learning to rebuild themselves side by side. Amelia found herself reaching for his hand when the baby kicked, and he never pulled away, his large palm steady, grounding her when anxiety whispered late at night. Then came the night when the quiet broke. Rain fell hard against the windows, thunder rolling through the distance like the earth itself breathing. Amelia woke to a sharp pain, unlike anything she had felt before. The realization hit in waves. It was time. Panic fluttered briefly before training and instinct took over. Ethan was at her side within seconds, his voice steady but his eyes wide with fear. The drive to the hospital blurred into flashes of rain and light, her hand gripping his so tightly that her knuckles whitened. He whispered reassurances he barely believed himself, yet his tone was calm enough to anchor her through every contraction. Hours blurred into an eternity of pain and hope, until finally, the air was filled with a sound that erased every fear. The first cry of their child, a fragile wail that seemed to tear open the walls around both their hearts. Amelia lay back exhausted, tears mingling with sweat. When the nurse placed the tiny bundle in her arms, she looked down at a face so impossibly small yet complete, eyes closed, fingers curling instinctively around her thumb. Her heart expanded until it felt too big for her chest. She turned her head toward Ethan, and for the first time saw him utterly undone. Eyes wet, mouth trembling, every wall he had ever built gone in an instant. "She's perfect," he whispered, his voice breaking, and Amelia nodded, unable to speak. In that moment, the chaos that had once defined their story vanished, replaced by an almost holy stillness. In the days that followed, the hospital room became a small universe of its own. Filled with soft light and the steady rhythm of new life, the tabloids wrote again briefly, but this time the tone was different. Admiration, fascination, even warmth. But neither of them cared. Their world had narrowed to the tiny heartbeat sleeping between them. Ethan spent hours just watching the baby breathe, as if memorizing every movement, every sigh. Amelia would catch him sometimes, that distant expression on his face, the look of a man who had spent years conquering empires only to be conquered by something so simple and pure. When they returned to the countryside house, everything felt new again. Mornings began with lullabies instead of alarms, and the air smelled of fresh bread and baby powder. The staff respected their privacy, tiptoeing through hallways like guardians of a sacred peace. Sometimes Ethan worked in the study with the baby's cradle beside his desk, pretending to read reports while secretly smiling every time she stirred. Amelia watched this transformation quietly. The man she had once seen as an untouchable figure of power now moved with gentleness, changing diapers, humming lullabies off-key, learning the language of fatherhood one tender mistake at a time. Weeks became months, and spring deepened into early summer. The garden outside bloomed wildly, vines climbing the old brick walls, life flourishing in every direction. One afternoon, while the baby slept in the shade, Amelia sat on the porch sketching the view. Ethan joined her, a quiet contentment resting between them. After a long silence, he spoke, his tone thoughtful. "You know, I used to think success meant control, over time, over people, over fate. But now I think it's just about moments like this, the ones you can't plan or buy." She smiled, setting her pencil aside. "Maybe the universe knew you needed a reminder." He chuckled softly. "Maybe it knew I needed both of you." She looked at him then, really looked, and for the first time she saw not the man from magazine covers, but the man who had stood by her through fear, who had faced the world to protect her dignity, who had learned to love without saying the word. And in that gaze something unspoken passed between them, quiet, certain, inevitable. That evening, as the sky turned gold and the baby stirred awake, Amelia lifted her from the cradle and whispered softly, "Look at the sunset, little one. It's the same sky that once felt too heavy for me, and now it feels like a promise." Ethan stood beside her, the child cradled between them, and for a long moment they simply watched the horizon together, their hands brushing, hearts steady, lives no longer divided by accident or circumstance, but joined by choice. The air around them hummed with the peace that comes only after surviving chaos, the peace of forgiveness. Months later, when Amelia returned to her studio in the city, her first new collection of designs bore a single title, The Promise of Tomorrow. Each piece carried fragments of her story, soft colors, resilient lines, quiet strength woven through fabric. When the exhibition opened, it wasn't fame she felt, but completion. Ethan attended quietly, standing at the back, holding their daughter in his arms, smiling with the quiet pride of a man who finally understood what it meant to build something that truly mattered. As the lights dimmed and applause filled the gallery, Amelia turned toward him, their eyes meeting across the crowd, and in that single moment she understood that their lives, once shattered by mistake, had been rebuilt by grace. Outside, night had fallen, the city shimmering beneath 1,000 golden lights. The same city where their pain had begun now held their peace, and somewhere in the middle of that vast glow, a little girl slept in her father's arms while her mother stood beside him, both looking ahead, unafraid, for the first time in their lives, of what tomorrow might bring.